At Indiana Farm Bureau, we serve tree farmers, goat farmers, and in fact, all farmers. With over 250,000 members, Indiana Farm Bureau represents a broad range of farmers and puts power in your collective voice. You also get advice from our subject matter experts, more affordable health plan options, and support for youth programs statewide. So whether you grow soybeans or strawberries, membership means you'll be heard. Become a member today at infb.org.
Welcome to Purdue Crop Chat, a regular podcast from Hoosier Ag Today and the Purdue University Extension Service, featuring Purdue Extension soybean specialist Dr. Shaun Casteel and Extension corn specialist Dr. Dan Quinn. Now your host for Purdue Crop Chat, Hoosier Ag Today's Eric Pfeiffer.
Welcome to the Purdue Crop Chat. Eric Pfeiffer here with soybean Shaun Casteel and Dan Quinn. And if you are watching today's podcast, you can see that we're on location. We're out here at ACRE in West Lafayette, and we've got some corn around us. I think maybe you can call it that, right, Dan?
It's if you want to call it that.
Yeah. We've had some issues here around West Lafayette and really around the state lately. It's been a little wet.
It has been really wet, and I always have issues with corn, but this year, there's a lot of issues.
Well, there are issues with soybeans too. Let's not, it doesn't discriminate, this rain.
Soybeans can have their problems with this rain too. It might be a little bit more visual in the corn, but soybeans have their problems as well.
Yeah. I think we both have full subscription to issues this year.
There are plenty of issues, and on today's podcast, again, if you're listening, that's great. You'll get the gist, but you really want to tune in and watch on our Facebook channel at Hoosier Ag Today, on YouTube at Hoosier Ag Today 1, because who would have thought that someone else had at Hoosier Ag Today on YouTube? Who are you, by the way? And, check us out, because you're really going to want to check out what they're talking about. They're going to show you some samples, some things that they're talking about in the field today. We're going to take a time out here on the Purdue Crop Chat, and they're going to jump right into it and talk about why this stuff looks so bad and what do we do now? This is the Purdue Crop Chat here on Hoosier Ag Today.
I'm Matthew Chapman, and I farm in Henry County, Indiana. Indiana Soybean Alliance and Indiana Corn Marketing Council invest checkoff dollars into building demand for corn and soybeans internationally. I've seen this work firsthand, and it's been eye-opening to see the growth in these markets, which also brings dollars back to our farms. Promoting U.S. corn and soybeans and increasing global demand is critical to the success of farmers right here in Indiana.
This message is brought to you by the Indiana Soybean and Corn Checkoffs.
Welcome back to the Purdue Crop Chat Podcast. My name is Dan Quinn, Extension Corn Specialist at Purdue. What I'm going to walk you through here, and behind me is we're at our West Lafayette Research Farm here at Purdue University, our Agronomy Center for Research and Education. But actually, we're in our Diagnostic Training Center, so the DTC here at Purdue that we use for a lot of our trainings, industry student type trainings. So what I'm going to show you behind me is just kind of a demonstration of what you're seeing a lot of around the state. If you get in your car and drive pretty much anywhere in the state of Indiana, you're probably going to see some corn that looks like this behind me. So the adage is always knee high by the 4th of July, right? A lot of this corn is less than my knee. That is not a good thing. So in many cases for the state of Indiana, today, if we have knee high by the 4th of July, that is not a good thing. And if you look behind me, this corn is actually less than knee high, and that is really not a good thing when you look at its overall health. But what we're seeing here is just corn that's been impacted by this significant amount of rainfall that we've had. Over the last 30 days, a lot of the state has had probably anywhere from 10 plus inches of rainfall. So we're seeing a lot of waterlogging, we're seeing a lot of ponding showing up in our fields. And this kind of gives you an example of what we're looking at. We're seeing a lot of uneven corn, a lot of corn that's just been sitting. So this corn was planted about 3 to 4 weeks ago. but it's just been sitting. A lot of it's only probably V4, V5 growth stage, so we'd expect with better drainage in this field, without these waterlogging and flooding conditions, that corn would be a lot more progressed. It's also got a different color to it too, so you're seeing a lot of corn that looks pretty yellow. If you look at the lower leaves, right, even here's some plants that I pulled up. Look at the lower leaves, you start seeing some of that yellowing showing up in the necrotic areas, but also yellowing that looks like nitrogen deficiency. So the big thing with corn is that when we get into these waterlogged soil conditions, when we have flooding, what we're really limiting is just the overall root health, so the root function. So oxygen depletion in our soils. So a lot of our soils end up being so saturated that we have no oxygen in the soils, and that just impacts the overall root function. The roots aren't functioning, and if the roots aren't functioning, our plant isn't functioning either. So we have a lot of plants that look pretty sickly. They're not growing. They're not taking up nutrients as well. So another thing that we often look at in these situations is just overall root health, right? We dug some plants. You can see the overall root health still is pretty good, but they're just not very big root systems. But you look at this mesocotyl region here, which is just that piece of root tissue between the seed and the base of the plant. So when corn plants are young, they actually rely on this mesocotyl here to move the nutrient reserves from the seed up into the base of the plant. And you look at that health of that root, right? It's starting to brown, kind of looks not very healthy, almost kind of necrotic. That can be where some of that plant was impacted. You look at the radicle and some of these nodal roots here, they still look okay. So they're still white, they look healthy, but there's just not much of these root systems. And so a lot of it is just, we just lost a lot of that oxygen in that soil. And these plants just aren't functioning. What's often unique, you can't really see that in this field, but in a lot of cases we'll see in severe flooding areas where plants actually exhibit drought symptoms, where we see some of that leaf rolling, and that's just the function of those plants just not having the ability to even utilize the water that's there. We have excessive water out there, saturation, but those roots aren't even taking it up. They're also not taking up nutrition as well. So one of the biggest impacts that we often see when we have both leaching and just flooding conditions following significant rainfall is just the loss of nitrogen, or just the fact that plants just can't take them up. So if you look at these lower leaves on these plants, here's kind of a telltale sign of a nitrogen deficiency, that leaf tip here moving into that mid vein here. So we have some necrotic lesions here in areas, even some lower plants, that these lower leaves that are actually dying off. So this is just a function of these plants. There's probably other nutrient deficiencies, maybe in a little bit of sulfur showing up. It's largely probably just due to these plants having compromised root systems where they're just not taking up any nutrition as well. So a lot of this has to do with, okay, when was nitrogen applied? How much nitrogen was applied? How much was the severity of the flooding and the duration of the flooding? A lot of these areas were ponded, right? We had ponding water, so a lot of nitrogen is probably lost in combination with these plants just not being able to take them up, largely through denitrification in these fields. So one thing we talk about is the famous question is, how much N did I lose? That's a very tricky question to try and answer. A lot of that has to do with when was the N applied, what was the rate applied, did we have a stabilizer, what was the source applied. There's a whole bunch of questions, and we can kind of narrow it down in that answer. But also, how much has this plant been impacted, period, right? Do we want to fertilize a plant like this for its full yield potential or not? And I would have to guess that this plant probably isn't going to see full yield potential. A lot of this corn will probably recover some as we get a little bit more oxygen in the soils, as we get a little bit temperatures where these plants are going to start to grow. So you'll see it recover some, but I expect a lot of these plants to either lag behind and have significant yield loss later in the season. Other impacts is that just the size of the plants will be impacted too. When we think about biomass, right, we have to have a certain amount of biomass of these plants and size to be able to maintain both pollination and grain fill in these corn plants. So I expect, you think about out in the middle there, you have plants that maybe had a little bit better drainage that look a little bit healthier. Those plants are probably going to out yield the plants that are behind us here. But in many cases, outside of making, rescue N applications if we can, or just gauging how that plant's going to recover, there isn't a whole lot we can do in this scenario. If we haven't side dressed yet, we can kind of, adjust those N rates. Side dress N applications might help a little bit when we think about opening up that soil slot a little bit for some oxygen. But a lot of fields around the state, right, either had full rates of N applied, have had significant flooding and ponding where those plants just aren't going to, they might recover some, but they're not going to recover to their full yield potential. Same thing with this plant. But a lot of it, when you think of flooding and waterlogging, it's dependent on, what stage is that plant at. So a lot of our earlier planted stuff around the state has kind of fared a lot better than this is a little bit later planted stuff here, and then what that duration is as well. So we lose oxygen in that soil after about 48 hours of flooding. But this just gives you an idea. If you drive around the state, it gives you an example of what these plants look like when we lose some of that function. If I took a tissue sample out of this here, it'd probably show me that I was deficient in everything. Does not mean that I have to apply everything. It's just largely that these roots haven't been functioning and those plants just can't take them up. So looking at recovery, these plants are probably going to survive, but they're not going to reach their max yield potential. They're probably going to struggle the rest of the year. Other things to consider, right? You think about the root system, compromised root systems. We're probably going to have issues if it does turn off dry on us. These areas are going to show drought symptoms a lot sooner than what we would in the past. You think about, some of our seedling diseases, crown rots, and diseases in general. We've started to see gray leaf spots show up in some of our trials, even here in this area. So be mindful of disease. I've had a few calls on crown rots showing up too. So you can look at the base of the plant, you can split the stalk, look at the overall health of that growing point region to gauge that as well. So just a lot of things to consider for plants, even throughout later in the season. They might be a little bit more susceptible to drought, susceptible to lodging, even more issues as we go later in the season. But this kind of gives you an idea of what we look for, what we look at. The disheartening thing is that outside of adjusting some of our fertility, if we can, there's not a whole lot we can do. We can hope that we get some dry spells, maybe a little bit cooler temps. Corn does a little bit better in cooler temps when it's trying to recover and we have flooding conditions. But I don't expect this corn behind me to yield to the level of what it would if we didn't have the flooding conditions.
All right, so we just got the walkthrough of the field there from Dan, Corn, Quinn, and Dan, you touched on a couple of really important points there. One, the big question of how much nitrogen did I lose. It sounds to me like there are a lot of different things that go into that question as well. You said it's a tough one to answer, but it's a tough one to answer because there are a lot of different things that have to be answered before that question can be answered, right?
See, that question is our poster child of it depends.
Yes.
There's some questions that have levels of it depends. That one is our poster child of it depends. It's just the inherent nature of nitrogen. A lot of nitrogen fertilizer and just mineralization of nitrogen from the soil is inherently controlled by the environment. So the transformations, the movement, it's all controlled by the environment and the conditions that we have. And as we all know, those conditions are not easy to predict. Even our weather apps, we try to get 7 days out and then it's still inaccurate. So that's the level of inaccuracies, but we can do what we can to at least get close. That's what I try to tell folks. A lot of it has to do with, when was it applied and what source did we apply? A lot of our fertilizer, when we have these early to mid-June rainfalls, a lot of it has probably been converted to nitrate N, because that's what we're after. Nitrate N can move, it can be lost via denitrification. But there's other aspects to that. Did we use a stabilizer, a nitrification inhibitor, something like nitropyrin or DCD in some of these, and that can help with that transformation period. And it all goes back to this question of how much N did we lose. So we need to know how much nitrogen was in the nitrate N form to then get an idea of how much maybe was lost. If it was just applied, a day ago and all of a sudden we caught a bunch of rainfall, maybe a lot of that was actually in the ammonium form and a lot of it maybe isn't lost. So it's always trying to gauge, did we lose a lot of nitrogen, or is it just these plants just have compromised root systems? The N's there, they're just not taking it up. So there's a lot of difficulties to that. And then also some of the soil samples. They're a snapshot in time. They're not perfect, but 12-inch soil samples to look at ammonium and nitrate N, that can at least give us a gauge on, this is how much we applied. This is what we expect our critical level to be. Are we below that or are we above that? And that can also give us an idea of, how much did we lose? Or hey, we still have plenty of nitrogen there. It's just these roots aren't functioning. So if these roots start getting functioning, I showed you some images where the root health was still pretty good out there. There just wasn't much of a root system. So hopefully some of that recovery will happen. We're seeing that in some of our trials, even this week with the warmer temps, as the plants are starting to tap into where that nitrogen was. Maybe it just moved a little bit, but it's still there, and they're starting to recover some. But yeah, it's a very, very difficult question that we try to get as close as we can to.
Shaun, I don't know about you, but that sounded a lot less like it depends and more of a heck if I know.
Well, I go back to, is he still talking about nitrogen? Like, that's all, is it 40 years of just nitrogen? Like, we got rain, nitrogen. Yeah. We didn't get rain, it's a drought, nitrogen. Yeah. It's like, it's all nitrogen, right? I mean, figure it out, dude.
Yeah.
It's called job security for the next 40 years. Yeah. So we'll be having the same conversation. Well, maybe, I don't know if you guys will still be around, but it'll be me and, the new host. And
oh, yeah, thanks.
That's all right. That's all right.
Old. You'll be on here with my kids someday.
Yep.
Dan, I do have to ask. I mean, we're out here, and I'm sweating, dude. It's hot. We're looking at 90s. I mean, it's going to be hot this week.
Mm-hmm. Can I?
Go ahead. Oh yeah. We're going to talk about corn sweat here in a moment. Don't worry, I'm going to get there. But I do want to. Is this good right now for this corn crop? I mean, it loves it, right? It's just us that hates it.
I think it's going to help some with the recovery. I almost look at it as kind of a balance because when we have saturated and waterlogged conditions, right? When we have high temps, it's actually a little bit harder on the crop in terms of we lose oxygen faster and that plant's trying to process and work a lot harder. Other side of that, a couple days like this, I think are going to help. We've seen it a little bit. I hope this doesn't persist, and if it doesn't look this way, but hopefully we don't turn off dry. But we have noticed that, walking trials and stuff like that, even this morning, even these warmer temps, it's kind of, allowed the soil to dry off a little bit. So we get a little bit of oxygen into that soil so those roots start functioning. And then those plants are starting to grow and move a little bit. So we're starting to see the root systems kind of get into that fertility down there a little bit. So we've seen a level of recovery in some of our plants that are a little bit more progressed even today. But also on the flip side of that is when we have persisting high temperatures, when we have these waterlogged conditions, it also can be a lot detrimental. Corn, when we have initial flooding in saturated soils, corn, I think soybeans too, right? When we have cooler temps, they actually survive a lot longer too. The oxygen depletion isn't as fast. But I do think these initial higher temps have allowed, the ground to dry out a little bit and also to get those plants kind of up and moving a little bit as well.
I think something that I see, it goes back to what are the field conditions while this 90-degree weather's coming through in the sun, right? And so, they're moist, but there's aeration. I think it's going to be fine, right? There's plenty of water, new roots are growing. And again, if you looked at that on corn, you look at it in soybeans, actively growing roots and the access to moisture, not saturation, I think it's probably going to be a good thing. If you're the guys down in the Southwest that got 3, 4, 5 inches and you have standing water and or flat out waterlogged and saturated, that's where I think we're going to have some issues with this kind of temperature. One day or so, okay, but you're going to burn through that limited oxygen that was there, and then now we're going to have some of that idea of, okay, roots are dying and we have some poor conditions on that recovery of that crop. So saturated conditions to ponding, maybe day okay. After that, it probably is going to be a little bit of an issue if it's fields like this that are, or I don't know about this, but I mean, it's got a ways to go. It's corn. It's sorry looking. But if they are drying out and their roots are growing, it's probably going to be a good thing.
Yeah, and I will add to it, a lot of it's going to have to do with where that crop is at too. You think about southern Indiana, we're starting to see a lot of corn that's starting to tassel out. The challenge with that, when you get into these corn that's tassel and early grainful, is that root system is maximized, right? That plant is starting to take everything it's built up at that point in time and then start moving it to the ear. These plants, have a little bit of aspect that they can recover and grow the root systems a little bit. Or if we get into, tasseled out corn and it's starting that grainfill process, right, those root systems kind of are what they are at that point in time. So then you add on where they just caught, 5-6 inches of rain and it can cause that oxygen depletion. That's probably going to start impacting some of the grainfill. And it may impact, pollination in areas too. So it also kind of, factors in where that crop is at.
So again, I hate asking more questions about corn, but I am. So when you've got this saturated condition conditions, waterlogged in the south with the tasseling, what yield component is it really affecting versus something that's the V6, V8s that are waterlogged? Is there any difference in yield components that are going to be compromised?
Yeah, I think it's going to be more going to be dictated on, during pollination, right? You're impacting that plant could potentially impact kernel number, right? Anything that impacts pollination, which is, that when you walk fields and you get yellow all over your hat, that 7 to 14 day period. But also a lot of it, I think, is going to impact where it's going to get impacted is grain fill. Both kernel abortion, where you have, those tips of those ears were pollinated and fertilized, but that plant just doesn't have enough. We think about, later grain fill. A lot of fields, what I've noticed this year is that the plants are just inherently smaller. They just don't have the biomass in the leaf area because they were impacted by some of these flooding conditions. So that's probably going to impact, some of that late season, both pollination and some of that late season grain fill. So kernel number, kernel size. Now these younger plants, when you look at V6, all the way up to V14, 15, even pre-tassel, that's probably going to also impact ear size. So you add that into your, kind of potential kernel number, also impacting the actual kernel number. So ear length might be impacted more so, rows around in severe cases at V6 to V8, right? So ear size, and then, I think these plants, we talked about that earlier, these plants are not going to reach their full maximum size and leaf area. They're going to be compromised the rest of the year.
So yield potential, you've touched on that. What kind of yield potential did we lose here? and I do love this question. But I feel like it kind of depends. How long were they underwater, right?
Yeah. I mean, he loves that question just so he can tell me I'm wrong either way.
We're about to that time of year where you have to start making some predictions too. So how much yield did we lose here this past couple weeks?
This will, you can take this and run with it, but I do think a lot of areas probably lost at minimum 10 to 15%. When you look at, where the plants are at, the size of them, the recovery level of them, I do think, again, the younger plants are probably losing a lot more yield than the later planted stuff that recovered a lot better or just tolerated the flooding a lot better. But I do think a minimum of 10 to 15%, but we have a lot of areas where the ponding was significant, and we have wide swaths of areas that the plant didn't survive at all. So you even look at, okay, what is the area of that field that didn't have any survival too? So areas that, if we see significant flooding for 7+ days, we might have 40, 50, 60% yield loss in areas too. But yeah, a lot of areas in the state, especially if you split the state in half and took the whole west side of the state, a lot of areas, had yield loss, and a lot of areas that'll recover some, but not to the full potential if we didn't have these conditions.
Now, I've never taken a side in this battle between you two, corn versus soybeans. But
because you already know.
All of the weathermen and women across the state are telling me that the reason I'm sweating so much today is because of this corn. So I think soybeans might have to be my favorite, right? Is that the corn is making me sweat, right? That's what's going on?
See, these media people, it's already starting. The corn sweat is the fault to why we sweat so much, right?
Isn't it, though?
It's a part of it. Yes, part of it.
But how big of a part?
Give us a percent there, Dave.
For giving me exact percent.
Yeah.
The thing is that aren't all three of us sitting out here sweating?
Nope, not I.
No, Shaun's not sweaty.
Shaun is immune.
Eric's glowing.
Yeah. So every plant is transpiring, right, and losing water. The trees, the grass, the corn, even the soybeans, right? So everything is contributing to the higher humidity levels in the air. Corn always just gets the bad rap because if you ever walk a cornfield, you don't have much air movement. It's really, really humid in there. But it's a very small percentage. I don't have the exact percentage off the top of my head. But you have to understand that they always talk about it at that point in time because everything is transpiring.
Even your soybeans.
Even my soybeans. That's what's actually helping us through this 90-degree weather, right? So let's put a totally different year. 2012 drought year. I remember going down 4th of July. It was about 2nd or 3rd of July. I was down in Posey County, and we had 100-degree days. Like the air temperature was 100 degrees. Soil temperature was 128 to 135, depending on where we were. And you could see soybeans that look really really good. Soybeans that are compromised, that had root systems that were in compaction zone versus those that didn't. And you shoot the leaf of the upper leaf and that looks good. It was 86 degrees because it's transpiring. It is cooling itself, right? It's bringing water up from the depths and cooling itself on these 101 degree days back then to the 90 degrees that we've got this year. Same thing on the corn side.
All right, I don't have a favorite then. All right, I'm still neutral in this battle. Hey, we're going to head to the soybean field next when we come back here on the Purdue Crop Chat. Stick around.
I'm Matthew Chapman, and I farm in Henry County, Indiana. Indiana Soybean Alliance and Indiana Corn Marketing Council invest checkoff dollars into building demand for corn and soybeans internationally. I've seen this work firsthand, and it's been eye-opening to see the growth in these markets, which also brings dollars back to our farms. Promoting U.S. corn and soybeans and increasing global demand is critical to the success of farmers right here in Indiana.
This message is brought to you by the Indiana Soybean and Corn Checkoffs.
Shaun Casteel with Purdue Crop Chat. We're coming back to the soybean field and taking a look at some saturated conditions, how the soybeans are responding to that. We're going to go on and walk through a field that has had standing water for a while, portion of that field, how those soybeans have responded. As you come in, I'll go ahead and dig up, but you can start to take a look and see where there's even some silt-covered leaves, so let's start there, right? So you got some silt-covered leaves, and so those are going to affect the photosynthetic process versus something a little newer. Right, do that comparison game. So again, when you start to cover the leaves here with the sand, silt, soil, whatever you've got, that's going to cause some issues in terms of accepting that sunlight versus this guy here. Let's try to do it side by side, where we're absorbing more of that sunlight and starting that process. So what has been some saving graces on some of these fields is actually some more rain that's washed this off a little bit at a time. You know, we don't want a lot, but enough to wash that off so it can still catch sunlight, can still photosynthesize as this field drains out. Now we're going to go and dig up, just look at some of these that are in that saturated condition. Nothing horrible, but certainly has had an effect. So let's dig up some of these guys and take a look. I'll break it up. We're going to look at root systems, look at nodules. I'm going to go ahead and put this in some water I'll bring in. Let that one soak up. All right. So one of the big things as we go and check out a field, I want to take a look at the number of trifoliate nodes and then also look at the root systems themselves. So on this one, we'll start off with how many trifoliate nodes. So unifoliate's in opposite position. The cotyledons were already below. So now at this point, we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Do you see a flower? 6, 7, 8. All right, so this is 8 trifoliates. It has a flower. It's into R1 right now. So in terms of how this is growing, developing, seems fine. I don't see any issues with the bottom portion of the plant. In more severe areas, you're going to see that the lower leaves, so unifoliates or trifoliates, are going to start to slough off because they've had that compromised root system. That's going to go, I said, I want to survive, so it's going to knock these guys off lower and lower, right? And you just continue to go through. We're going to show you parts of the field that didn't have this saturated ponded area, and you're going to notice that, okay, instead of the 7 or 8 nodes that we have, we're probably going to be more like 9, 10, and probably a little bit more advanced. Let's look at the root systems while we're here. So again, this field in particular, not looking too bad considering the saturated conditions. What we want to look at is now the nodules themselves. White, red, or dead. Today on this one, we're going to see a lot of the whites and the reds. So advancing, the earlier ones are looking good. You're going to just go between your fingernails and bust those open and take a look. Hey, do I have a little pinkish color, white color, or brown? This one's still pink, and those are actively growing. So even with, as long as these fields, this area has been saturated, it's growing out of it. So that's a good thing. A field like this, I mean, it's clearly a highlighter green. There's another pink one. So what's going to be, as we pan out, and maybe Eric can do this later, is you can see that this is an area that is more highlighter green versus we go up a couple feet and the slope of the field, darker green, more nitrogen content. So it goes back to a similar story that, that Dan talked about in corn. We need nitrogen from the soil and fixation. So if we have these saturated conditions, so whether they're denitrifying, losing that nitrogen from the soil, or their nitrates are leaching, we're losing out on that, as well as, okay, we're compromising nodulation and fixation for a little bit. Fortunately, this part of the field, it hasn't compromised to the point of death. We don't have nodules that are dead. We don't have roots that are dying. So there's going to be more saturated conditions where you're going to start to pull off, and maybe we'll catch another video on this where you can pull off and slough off those roots that have been saturated for a long time. The nodules are also going to be that same kind of mushy or slough off. So those are the worst case scenario. Other parts, as we look and assess, again, nodulation looks pretty good on this one. It's compromised in terms of overall growth because of limited oxygen. Wasn't able to respire and use all the photosynthetics that we really want to, but not the worst case either. I just got done talking, I think this is about 7 or 8 trifoliate nodes. Some good rules of thumb is whenever you're looking at the nodules, you basically at this point need about double the number of trifoliate nodes in terms of the nodules that are actively fixing nitrogen. So as I count up 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 or 9 already, and I'm not busting them open because I already know they're going to be active, and flip it over, and there's well north of double. So in terms of a nodule load, even though they look highlighter green, that doesn't cause me any concern with the nitrogen supply. It's just going to be taking a little time to bring it back. Again, probably a 10 to 14 day to bring it back to a nice dark green color. We're going to go and walk up and do the better looking beans and compare those. Come on up. Again, doesn't seem like much of a difference here, but coming up a little bit higher up in the field, dig up some of the good beans. Should be able to see some differences in overall canopy of this, right? You think about the growth, that respiration. We're able to continue growing, respiring, burning those photosynthetates. So in that, break that up. So in that process, they're continuing to grow vegetatively. Again, look at the draw, whatever I get, let's see what they look like. So coming up on the plant, you already notice a lot more branching on this particular field. There is a little bit of silk covered, but not nearly as much as the other plant. Let's count the trifoliate nodes. So if you recall where the cotyledons were already gone, unifoliates, on the saturated field in the earlier part of June, those were already sloughing off. There was no branches coming off. This one actually does have branches that are going to produce pods that you already see developing right now. Number of trifoliate nodes, 1, 2, here, I'll go and break them down so it's easier to see. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and 10. So 10 trifoliate nodes. Flowering all the way up. We're almost to R2. There's a flower on the main stem. Come up to upper 2 nodes, that'd be R2. So this is advanced in terms of the number of trifoliate nodes, probably on the order of about 3 or so. Advanced in terms of the number of flowers, and you're already starting to see pods. So there is differences between this. This is going to yield better. It is going to have that advantage. In terms of any rescue, I go back to, I don't think I want to pull the trigger or anything there. Roots are still actively growing. There's good nodulation, but you get into those fields and those situations that are compromised, those are going to be the ones to really start to think about. Let's look at the nodule load on this guy. I'll try to. All right, so root systems are much bigger. All right, and again, I'm going to see if I can catch the one I just happened to dig up earlier. All right, so I'll try to go against my chest here. So let's switch it up here. So root systems, a little more compromised on those that were in the saturated condition versus those that are not. So you did have some roots that are limited in development. What is interesting here, there's not a lot sloughing off on the saturated one, but you can start to see some newer bright white growth on the better plants, you're going to see that same kind of thing as the fields dry out on the saturated conditions. So again, you want to start looking for those bright whites, those feeder roots that are coming off now. Those are going to be the points where there's root hairs. That's when bacteria are going to infect. Bradyrhizobium will continue growing that nodule and continue to provide more nodulation and fixation just like that. With that, I think we're pretty good on this field for now.
All right, so we just went through the soybean field here on the Purdue Crop Chat, and Shaun, I mean, you can see behind us, there is a significant difference between the front part of the field here and the back part there.
Sure.
Again, from a yield standpoint, where you're talking about this, like you say, this one's going to yield better, that one's going to yield worse. Do you have a difference in mind based on, again, how long it was underwater there or anything else?
Yeah, I mean, there's some good rules of thumb. You can think about some of those, let's say V4 saturated conditions, waterlogged, a bushel or so an acre a day kind of thing, probably beyond the first 3 days. Once it's been saturated that far, we have oxygen depletion occurring. Now we have the roots that are compromised. I say V4, V5, those middle to late vegetative stages, going to be a bushel to bushel and a half on some of those for each day after that.
I'm just impressed, Dan, that we didn't have to call a student out here for him to use the shovel out there. His hands are dirty.
What is that?
I didn't know he could do that anymore.
I got calluses on my hands. I work. Come on.
We have to get out there a few times during the year just to
when the video's on,
make it look like in the video.
When the video's on.
When the video's on, yeah.
Yeah, make sure the bosses are driving by or invite them out too, right?
Yeah. So we're out here today at ACRE here at the DCT, and we have some friends here with us. Brian, come here, Brian. Brian Overstreet is here. And Brian, you guys were doing a webinar here earlier today with the Conservation Cropping Systems Initiative. Brian with them as well, and Brian, I understand you had a question here for the guys that you wanted to ask. So ask them. They're here. Go for it.
So I work with the farmers on doing conservation tillage and more regenerative cropping. So have you guys noticed any differences in fields that are doing that types of methods of farming? Are we getting better drainage off those in the long run and getting faster recovery on those than these others that have been treated a little differently?
Let's start with Dan.
Well, I'll say, the field we were in is, I think, an area at the DTC that they do very heavy tillage, right? And so one thing you'll notice with heavy rainfalls and waterlogged soils, when you have really heavy tillage, a lot of areas where we do have that hard pan in that field, where we're just not getting that penetration of the water. Soil crusting is often a lot worse in areas where we've had heavy tillage. So, a lot of cases where we see the no-till soils, the no-till in this area is particularly, a lot of the no-till, right, keeps the soils a little bit cooler and a little bit more moist. So those plants just kind of get a little bit slower start off to the growing season, but they also have better water holding capacity, but also in many cases better drainage too. You think about root channels and stuff like that, maybe not as much of an impact of that hard pan area. So seeing areas that that field I was in is some of the worst, heaviest tillage at the DTC here. It's probably the worst looking area here too. So you may see some differences out there, but one aspect with no-till a lot of times is that you see a little bit better drainage, maybe a little bit better water movement in those soils.
And I think I want to bring up the just field variations in their own right? So I think about, we're on prairie dirt here for the most part. We can go stone's throw, go in forest soil, but let's go on beyond this. Let's go to those that have a roll to it, right? Some topography to it. I think about those areas. That's probably been a saving grace on a lot of these fields. I like in terms of having better drainage internally, but I think some of the surface drainage is probably going to end up helping a lot of these fields. Is that the worst areas are going to be pretty nasty because we've had 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 inch rains, not just a week of that, but a day of that. And so a lot of that surface flow has probably gone off into those low-lying areas, but those ridge tops, so whether they're sands or clay knobs or anything like that, I think in a year like this, those are probably going to end up shining and help making up some ground in terms of overall yield on that field. I think about where you're from, the great 1 inch rise for every 10 feet or something. It's basically a foot or two is a hill over. You see that hill over there, right? So those areas are still going to be a case where I think that we have better drainage that helps a little bit with the roots that aren't going to have compromised conditions. So anything that's going to help with drainage is going to be a good play for us this year.
And I think, when we talk about conservation cropping, I mean, every cropping system is different, whether it's a conservation one or not, and there are advantages and disadvantages to each one. This is one of those where, the conservation cropping system, it is an advantage where you can get a lot of that water out, it holds it better, and you can save it for later on in the season. That's kind of what we're talking about here, right? I mean, yeah, it got real wet. Maybe it spread itself out a little bit better.
Yeah, it might help with that infiltration. I do think there's a little bit on the opposite side too. I'll bring these in because those systems hold water better, right?
Yeah.
You think about excess water. I was in Southwest Indiana a few weeks ago, and we actually were seeing that some of the no-till fields didn't look as well because they were holding water. When you get into drought conditions, right, that's a good thing. One thing where we really see no-till shine a lot of times is that you get later in that season where the drought, and then they'll kind of catch up or even surpass because they're holding water better. So in some of these saturated environments, right, you might have better infiltration, but you also have areas that have better water holding capacity. So you think about waterlogging and saturated soils, they might be a little bit cooler too. So they can hold on water a little bit longer and impact those plants on that side too.
So if we get into a drier situation here and a drought situation here later in the season, that's really going to play well.
Right, and that's what I was going to bring up, is that maybe some of those are struggling right now, but as we get 90 degrees for a week or two, those could almost flip because they have better water holding capacity. They have roots that are now growing and responding to that condition. So I do think that July, August recovery is going to be key on that system.
Brian, any other questions?
Well, that water didn't run off; it stayed there, so it was able to be used later. So, no, that was the one question I thought of while Dan was talking that I thought we ought to ask.
So he wasn't listening to Dan, but he was thinking about good questions. I'll also go with the idea that, we've had these intense rains, and so in some ways Dan and I both, I'll go and put us both, I was like, they ran off quick. Well, that may not be a good thing. The water came off quick for that current season, but guess what also went with it, some of that soil. So we're losing out on that. So in the current season might be good because they ran off so quick, but oh man, we lost some of that, or we gave it to Illinois because it went down Wabash and everything.
We lost nutrients with that soil too. It wasn't just the soil we're losing, it's the nutrients and that water we may need in August.
Yep.
Well, guys, again, thanks for taking us out to the field today. This was a good demonstration. It was a good time coming out here and checking some things out. Better than Hat Studio 2A, heading down to my studio there, 3A.
It changes every time. Podcast right? So this is another change.
This is 4C.
Yeah.
This is 4C. Okay, yeah. The Hatmobile's right over there. I think it's Hat Studio 3B. We just whatever we want to do on the road, we just hop in there. But guys, thanks so much for doing this. Really appreciate it. And we'll be back here. We'll do it again in a couple weeks here on the Purdue Crop Chat. What's up, Shaun?
I just want to go ahead and say you'll link to. We've got some articles on this, but I want to share because we didn't get into it today. But back in 2015, we had a similar year in terms of just 20 inches of rain, train of rain. We did a lot of treatments, and there's a lot of treatments that are getting pushed. I'm getting phone calls on this. I know you're talking about nitrogen because that's all you talk about. But there's other things. Nutrients are limited. Nitrogen. There's manganese. There's other things out there. Roots. Indolacetic acid is available. Biostimulants. So there's a lot that's going to push. And so what can we do? We want to do something. We want to try something. We'll link it to some of the work that we've done. I did 18 treatments a number of years ago, and kind of hear that storyline too.
And is it fair to say, was it worse in 2015? Are we in better shape now?
When I pulled the data and created it on the map, this whole state of Indiana in 2015 was in pretty sad condition for the month of June. However, if we go to our Southwest friends, right, you talked about that visit, that May was pretty nasty. They started drying out, then they just got hit again. So they're probably just as bad as it was in 2015 at the state level. I think we're better. I think it is this western third, this western slice of Indiana. It's going over to Illinois and catching some more of them there. I'll flip it on the eastern side. We had a lot of rain on the Northeast in particular early on, so some late plantings, but they're not taking it on the chin like the Junes that the rest of the state is.
They're just kind of getting used to it at this point, right? I mean, that's could become a normal planting date for them.
Yep, late May, Memorial Day, let's not go on vacation. Let's go out there first week of June. But they needed a good June to kind of get through the rough start that they had.
Absolutely. Well, we'll absolutely get you some of that information. Check us out, HoosierAgToday.com. Download the Purdue Crop Chat and listen to it. But again, if you're listening to this one, you really need to check out the video. A lot of great stuff this time. Check it out on Facebook at Hoosier Ag Today and also YouTube, Hoosier Ag Today 1. I'm going to find you at Hoosier Ag Today on YouTube. I'm going to find you. Thanks for joining us. We'll do it again next time on the Purdue Crop Chat. I'm Eric Pfeiffer with Dan Quinn and Soybean Shaun Casteel, and Brian too. We'll catch you next time.
This has been Purdue Crop Chat, a regular series featuring Purdue Extension's Dr. Dan Quinn and Dr. Shaun Casteel, made possible by the Indiana Corn and Soybean Checkoffs, the Indiana Corn Marketing Council, and the Indiana Soybean Alliance. The Checkoffs are pleased to help bring you agronomy insights from Purdue Extension. Opinions on the podcast are those of the host and guests and not those of the sponsor. Purdue Crop Chat is a service of Purdue University Extension and Hoosier Ag Today. Timely, relevant, credible.